in the matter of the last 4 years or so, the lending industry has come around to recognizing green buildings have a premium and green buildings have less risk and green buildings should have a lower uh, interest rate associated with loans because they are a better investment.
Mm.
I and that took a long time, right? I mean, we've been talking about sustainability really since the 70s. And just now lenders are coming around to that in a meaningful way to offer incentives for green building programs.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Clean Techies podcast, where we interview climate tech founders and VCs to discuss all things building and investing to solve the biggest challenge of our generation, climate change. This is episode 90 of the show. I'm your host, Silas Maynard, and thank you for joining us on today's episode. If you are a returning listener, we thank you, first of all, for returning, but we also ask you to help us in two specific ways. One, we ask that you please, if you have not already, subscribe and go follow us on YouTube as well. As you know, a lot of effort goes into this show, or at least hopefully you know, a lot of effort goes into this show, and it's really helpful if you can help us from the listener's side. And then secondly, we'd like you to send this episode to two people you know, perhaps one that may like this content, somebody that you know is interested in the space, and one person that perhaps disagrees with you. We find it kind of interesting to send it to these people and see if we can ever change their mind. Who knows? Maybe we'll get lucky one day. And this will very, very much help us spread the word of the show in general. And if you're returning, please do leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, as it helps us quite a lot with the distribution. And before we get into the episode details, again, a note for any founders listening. If you're a founder looking for funding or looking for potential partnerships, always feel free to reach out. We're glad to make any introductions that we can. And a big thank you to our sponsors, NextWave Partners, for making this show possible. NextWave are experts in talent acquisition, recruitment, and retention across the climate tech, renewables, and ESG spaces globally. So if your team is growing or you're looking to make a career change yourself, reach out to them at next-wavepartners.com or reach out to one of their consultants directly via their LinkedIn page. All right, so let's get into the episode details. Today we're joined by Chris Gray, the CTO of RENU Communities. At its simplest form, they are a private equity fund that is doing total retrofits on real estate to make it sustainable building, to make these buildings sustainable. The more interesting aspect of what they're doing is really one, they have an in-house set of experts that are able to help them integrate the engineering knowledge with the financial modeling of the projects when they're doing the deal. Secondly, they take a very high quality approach on how they manage the retrofits so that it does not impact the tenant's life. I think this was quite interesting and maybe something a lot of people overlook, but just the pure quality and focus on the experience for the tenants was interesting to me. And then thirdly, they engage with their tenants to help them understand the benefits of the newly installed upgrades. It's possible that many people are not aware of why they've had these installs done or what the real benefits are, so they engage with them to ensure they are aware of what's actually happening, right? And then I guess at the end, that was also interesting. Chris had some interesting insights on the IRA bill, which directly contribute to the bottom line of real estate owners. So if you own real estate, you might want to check that part out as well. Some pretty interesting things he mentioned there. I'm glad we ended up talking about that as well. But with that, let's get into the episode. All right, welcome to the show, Chris. How are you doing?
I'm great, Silas. How are you?
I can't complain. It was a lovely day in New York City with the sun shining, so I'm not going to complain at all. Where are you calling from?
I'm in Atlanta, Georgia, so it's been a beautiful day here as well. We can finally see spring in the midst.
Very nice. I mean, I think spring and New York and Atlanta are probably very different, but at least it's a similar excitement, right, for the future of what's coming, right?
Absolutely.
Very good. So let's just start at the beginning. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're doing today.
So I am Chris Gray. I run a company called RENU Communities, and it's my way of changing the world, right? So I am an engineer by education, a mechanical engineer, master's in mechanical engineering, took that a bit further and did a PhD in civil engineering focused on sustainable construction. Prior to that, I was a mechanical contractor. So really focused on energy and the application of energy in many different ways throughout my career. But I currently lead a company called RENU Communities, which is a subsidiary of a private equity real estate investment firm called Taurus Investment Holdings. And so I've had a varied career in energy all throughout, but it led me here to work for Taurus. And throughout my engineering career, I always really wanted to change the world, and having the opportunity to come to Taurus allows me to improve buildings, which is one of the major areas of energy improvement that are needed in order to meet a carbon neutral energy future.
Yeah, interesting. Could you tell me more about when you talked about your education, it sounded like from the very beginning you started in sustainable building management or sustainable kind of engineering. How did you become interested in sustainability as a whole, and kind of how has that journey unfolded from what you thought it was prior to getting into it actually, and what it is actually working in it?
Yeah, so like I said, it really started from being a contractor and really seeing the way buildings are built and seeing the way energy is consumed through mechanical systems, HVAC systems, heat pumps, that sort of stuff. Um, and going through mechanical engineering, you really learn about those energy systems, and it's all about the flow of energy. At least the specialization that I focused on is all about energy transformation and energy flows in all different ways. And so my mind always went back to buildings. It always went back to the systems that I had known in previous careers. And it allowed me to really put context into everything that I was learning. And so my mind just naturally gravitated toward energy. I spent the first 10 years of my career working for Southern Company, which is a large gas and electric utility holding company based out of the Southeast. And my focus area was energy efficiency and energy consumption in buildings. So I was focused on heat pumps, heat pump water heaters, lighting systems, building envelope systems, and really trying to improve the efficiency of those for our customers. And so that really got me interested in the world of academic research, but also the world of practical application research and perfecting technologies that are really needed to make leaps and bounds improvements in energy efficiency. And so it was really a space that allowed me to connect the practicality of what I'd known before as a contractor to the academic side of what's emerging in the industry, and apply those directly through applications research in applied field setups. So it really connected me with what I had a passion for, which was making a difference in energy and in people's lives, and seeing the opportunity that we have around energy efficiency in buildings. I then sort of leveraged that to go through different roles that were more customer facing in the operation side of a utility, looking at the connection of the energy distribution directly to major customers. So working with residential, commercial, and then large industrial, sort of the largest customers you can imagine that are on the megawatt scale. And so it gives you a perspective of just how much energy consumption there is out there, but also how much opportunity there is to reduce that consumption. That led me to working in the venture capital space in the utility, looking at emerging companies in the energy space, and then on to RENU Communities, where I get a chance to pull it all together and really put it into action in buildings and make a difference in the real estate sector.
Mm-hmm. I'm kind of interested. I know it's not exactly the topic of this, but given your experience in Southern Power, I'd be keen to know what is their incentive to try to get people to be more efficient, because obviously they're selling electricity, right? I feel like they'd like to sell more of it. So I'm just kind of curious about the mindset internally on energy efficiency. Could you talk to us about that?
Yeah, I would say it's different for every utility, right? There's different drivers. You've got the carrot and the stick, and every utility has different reasons for doing it. Some of it's regulatory driven, where your regulators say you have to do this. Some of it is the fact that it's what's best for your business, because there's avoided cost from having to build new generation, or having aging infrastructure that you have to maintain. So energy efficiency helps you reduce the demand on your existing systems, and it helps you avoid cost of future systems. And then there's the fact that it's just the right thing to do, right? And I think each and every utility takes a combination of each of those, but they're their meter sort of leans in one way or another. Um, for my particular area of work and my area in research, it was all about giving the customers the best technology insight. So I was testing technologies that were emerging in the market that customers had questions about, and our customer facing teams needed to be armed with the information to appropriately advise their customers.
Interesting. Could you talk to us a little bit about the total carbon emissions from buildings? I'm kind of curious if you have some high level stats around this before we get into how your technologies are applied.
Yeah, the general rule of thumb is 40% of carbon emissions in the US come from buildings. And that's just astounding to think about. When you look into the industrial sector of manufacturing, you look at energy production in general from a industrial sense, you look at transportation, and those are 60% of emissions, and yet buildings and the energy associated with running and operating the buildings that we live in, work in every day is 40%. So it's not necessarily where you think about an emission occurring, but when you map out the building all the way back to the source of the energy, it is a very, very significant portion of the overall emissions in the US. So while it's not the sole target that we have to focus on, it is absolutely a major one that gets overlooked a lot of times.
Mhm. I'm kind of curious because even if you take away before the interest in climate change and kind of reducing carbon emissions was really mainstream, it would seem to me that building owners should already have had an interest in efficiency from an operational cost perspective. Could you maybe speak to, I guess maybe it's more speculative, but like in your opinion, why have real estate owners not been pushing for these types of technologies sooner before it seems like now prop tech is, or at least green prop tech is exploding and people are trying to find new ways to reduce carbon emissions of buildings. Could you talk to why you don't think it has expanded sooner than this?
Well, some of it is around looking at it a different way, and why has green technologies really exploded now? And I think it's because real estate owners are being forced to think about it from their investors, right? It all comes back down to the money, and where's the where's the money coming from, and that drives all the decisions. um, and so now that you have your institutional capital managers, your institutional real estate companies focusing on energy efficiency, focusing on sustainability and carbon emissions, then it naturally drives the industry to focus on it. Now, historically, there's not necessarily been a focus on energy efficiency because in most real estate transactions, the energy costs are passed along to the tenant,
Mm,
right? And in industrial buildings, office buildings, even multifamily, in a vast majority of those cases, the energy is either directly billed to the tenant or it's passed through to the tenant. And so it's not an area that there's really a big incentive to focus on. There's the split incentive between the real estate owner or the landlord investing in energy efficiency and the tenant benefiting from it. So if you're not going to create these huge returns for your building, why would you put the time and effort into focusing on the energy consumption of your building when the tenant's just going to benefit? And then you may or may not be able to recover that from the tenant,
mhm,
right? So I think the industry is now evolving to say, okay, it's not just about the energy component, it really is about the environment as well. And you
mhm,
have to combine the two. And if you can do them, if you can appease both at the same time by saving money, saving the tenant money, and creating environmental benefit at the same time, why wouldn't you?
mhm,
You're a responsible real estate owner now if you focus on it.
mhm. Yeah, I do think that's an interesting point. I guess I usually tend to think about this not in the perspective of the tenants paying the electricity, but that makes a lot of sense, right? And that's why some of the larger corporations had been already focusing on these things, right?
Right.
Trying
Right.
to handle it themselves because for them those savings really stack up. Um, Very good. Let's move into talk us through kind of the process. I really want to go a little bit nerdy here, kind of
Sure.
step by step, break down for us what are the aspects of creating a green building essentially? What are the major aspects besides just energy efficiency? And how do you go about when you select a property? Talk to us about what type of properties it is and go through the whole process with us kind of step by step. I might interject with some questions along the way.
Yeah, not a problem. So it's a process that we've really honed over the last 3 years, right? So Renew Communities was founded toward the end of 2019. So we're a little over 3 years into the existence of our business. And there's a learning curve to how do you wrap your head around retrofitting a full building? And kind of the first things that we've learned is how to choose a building. And that's the interesting point about Renew Communities being embedded within Taurus Investment Holdings is we are evaluating the buildings hand in hand and side by side with the asset evaluation team. So when our asset teams are looking at acquiring a property, we are partners with them in that process and evaluating the opportunities right beside them. So they're looking at what is the flooring, what does the facades look like, what does the countertops look like, and we're going into the mechanical closets and looking at what is the water heater, what does the HVAC system look like. We're opening dishwashers and refrigerators and getting model numbers to evaluate what the age of those systems are and the efficiency. We're looking at the roof to determine the age of the roof and the exposure. So we're really looking at it from an engineering and an energy standpoint. And the simple answer is there is no criteria that we would just step away and say, no, you can't do this. What we do is give an educated report back to the asset team to say, these are the items that we would address. These are where we think we can create an accretive retrofit solution for the property. And this is what our estimate of the cost is going to be. And that just goes into the underwriting of the deal. And if it's accretive, then we continue. If we continue to bid on the asset. If we win the asset, then at that point, my team goes through and does a deep dive during the due diligence process, which is probably the biggest learning for us is we had to learn how to get very detailed evaluations of a building in a very short window of time. So a due diligence process is typically about 30 days. So that means you have to get your conceptual engineering design complete. You have to get your system selections and equipment selections complete. You have to go in and evaluate how quickly you can retrofit and kind of develop a retrofit plan that doesn't disrupt tenants, all in this 30-day window while getting bids from contractors so that by the time we close on the property, we're ready to start the implementation of the retrofit. And a lot of that is done on site, but really most of that work is done back in our offices, right? We will go to a property and we'll do a 1 to 2 day walkthrough, do a full energy audit, capture all of the details of the property that we can. And then we go back to the office and start the engineering process to build an energy model, to look at all of the local grants and rebates and incentives available, to look at the different equipment selections that could be possible for that particular building. And then we develop that scope and go out to contractors to start gathering pricing from GCs. So it's a very quick process, but it's really holistic based on the building and the market, right? So the buildings itself, every building is built in a different location, so different geography, different age, different construction methods, different mechanical systems, different age of the mechanical systems on the property, different amounts of deferred maintenance. When you start to look at renewables, every single utility market has slightly different renewable interconnection rules. And so you have to touch on each and every part of this to be able to develop this retrofit scope. And then you start to look at the other components of your question, which is what makes a green building, right? It's not just energy efficiency. So we have to evaluate the water systems, meaning the simple things like the aerators and the flow rate of your sink faucets and your shower heads. But then we pull apart the toilets and we look at the mechanisms inside the toilet to see, okay, what's the water efficiency of this toilet? We go outside, we see if there's irrigation systems, and we look for ways to improve the irrigation system efficiency. And so it's beyond just energy, but we're looking at water as well as comfort as well, trying to evaluate what the comfort of the individual building is. So it's a very detailed process that we develop a generalized scope and a generalized budget during that due diligence timeline. And then by the time we close on the property, we're ready to start going out and securing GC bids on our work. So I know there's a lot to your question, but I'm hoping I touched on each of it.
I think we've got most of it. So aside from the water systems and energy efficiency kind of measures, maybe we could kind of speak largely appliances and things that consume water, looking at those. But what about installing renewables, or I don't know if I'm using the term correctly, but heat pumps and kind of making this building just green friendly? And especially, I'm assuming people who would be interested in renting here might be Tesla drivers, for example, electric car owners, right? Could you talk about those other aspects that you integrate into it? And is that integrated into every building?
Yeah, so that's part of our evaluations we're going through, is looking at the local utility space for energy rates, but also renewable energy opportunities. So we're looking at the net metering standards. We're looking at what the interconnection requirements are. We're looking at how we can integrate renewables into the project, because in fact, I don't believe we've done a project that didn't have solar in some form or fashion connected to it. And then we're evaluating the EV chargers as well. So looking at the opportunity to future-proof the property through installing infrastructure up front, maybe not building out each and every charger that you will need 10 years down the road, but making sure that the conduits are pulled and the infrastructure is there so that you can install one pedestal now and have that expand into multiple pedestals in the future. So heat pumps and heat pump water heaters and any type of heat pump related technology is kind of core to what we look at on the mechanical system side. So we work to electrify the property, meaning eliminate fossil combustion up front, but then apply heat pumps in as many applications as possible. But that's where it goes back to the engineering knowledge of knowing what type of heat pump to install, what type is possible, because you've got many different types of heat pumps. You've got ground source heat pumps, air source heat pumps, cold climate heat pumps, right? They're all the same basic concept, but the design of them is a bit different and the installation implications are a bit different. When we start to install renewables, right, each of these work paths has to really work in parallel. So if we're going to go into a property, and we're going to do water heater replacements, HVAC replacements, window replacements, sliding door replacements, and solar, right? That's a ton of work that really has to be completed in stages. So, for example, we'll attack the envelope first, right? Because that's something that can be accomplished in a very quick period of time on a unit by unit basis. One of our goals in any retrofit is not to displace tenants, right? We want to make sure that the tenants have their space. We don't have to wait necessarily for them to vacate, but we want to be able to implement our retrofit in an occupied unit. So that requires us to think about a procedural timeline of how we can implement the upgrades. So if we're going to do the envelope, we'll go in and do insulation, windows, and doors all at the same time. And that means that our contractors have to go in and be able to, in one day, replace the windows, the doors, and possibly insulate in one unit in one day. And then we'll have the next crew come in and they have to be able to decommission the existing HVAC system, install and recommission the next HVAC system so that they don't ever leave the tenant without heating and cooling, right? And so the way that realistically operates is typically You'll get the new system as close to operational as possible. Then you'll decommission the old system, make the final transition in a day. And from the morning to the afternoon, the tenant now has a full brand new operating HVAC system. Then you'll have things like lighting, where you'll have a contractor come through and replace all of the lighting in the unit. And the water heater will be a next stage. You'll have a plumbing crew come in, pull out the old water heater, put in a new water heater, make sure by the end of the day it's up and running. So it's really focused on the process of implementing the retrofit to make sure that we don't impact the tenant's life. And then the solar, luckily that's mostly done exterior. And then you have to communicate or coordinate with the utility and the tenant to do the final interconnection, which means the tenant's going to lose power for a short period of time. But again, you're focused on not leading them down for any extended period of time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it seems like an operational nightmare, to be honest, but obviously that's where you bring in the specialties, right? One thing, I guess I'm just kind of curious, you kind of spoke to it, but I maybe just ask it very clearly. Are there any specific aspects of this? I mean, it sounds like, in my estimation, the windows insulation and doors would be probably one of the most invasive types of replacements that happens in the process, right? But are there any things that tend to be really difficult to do, like as the most quote unquote most difficult aspect of doing a retrofit for a building?
To be honest, replacing a window and door is not that complicated of a process. That can actually be done pretty quickly when you have a skilled crew who does it repetitively, time after time after time. When you hand a crew hundreds of units on a property, they can streamline that very well, and they get very good at what they do. We have HVAC crews that can replace 4 units in a day, which is, it's very aggressive. The hardest things, just to be frank, is when you have asbestos, right? And older properties typically have asbestos. If you're 1970s or prior, you've probably got asbestos that you have to deal with. Now, some properties have been, you've had drywall that's been changed out, or you've had the asbestos remediated at some point, so it doesn't always come up. But when you have that, you have to go through the very specific regimented abatement process for asbestos, and that eats up a day in and of itself, right? Mm-hmm. You have to go in, completely blanket off the system. You've got to remediate, you've got to air test, you got to make sure that there's no asbestos remaining, and then you can go back in and continue the rest of the work. So when that comes up, it does create issues, and it just extends the timeline. But again, it has to be put into that process where you can get it done and get out, in order to maintain the tenant's occupancy.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. When you put all these things together, and I know it's probably different for every building, but generally speaking, if you have rough numbers to be interested, what are the cost savings when you look at the entire lifetime, right? Not just monthly cost savings, but when you look at, hey, we're investing in all this equipment up front as a lifespan of 20, 30 years, whatever, what tend to be the overall lifetime savings for doing a building? Is there any way you can help us understand this? I know it's difficult because every building's different.
Yeah, so it depends on where you're starting and where you're ending, right? But for example, on a property in Florida, for example, that's the first one that comes to mind, where you do an HVAC retrofit and a water heating retrofit that saves you $120 a month, right? So now you're at $1,400 a year, over 20-year lifespan. You're almost $30,000 in savings in present day dollars. Now, one of the things that is beneficial is the energy rates tend to climb, right? And so your savings continue to go up year after year after year. But there's also savings to the property, right? I mean, each and every one of those pieces of equipment that you replaced either were failed or were going to fail at some point. So that's one of the reasons we look at Class B older properties, is because they've got a lot of deferred maintenance. You've got a lot of equipment that's been bandaged together, or it's limping along, and it really needs to be replaced anyway. And so now you're looking at, instead of a $10,000 cost to replace a system with an advanced heat pump. Now you're looking at the offset and the avoided cost of replacing a system with a $6,000, $7,500 base efficiency system. So your incremental cost is now less, and it's easier to justify the investment.
Mm-hmm. So I guess my question is, do you typically go in, since it's private equity model, with the intention to kind of be able to find these properties, raise the value? Because from an ROI perspective, it sounds like the length of time is very difficult for somebody with a shorter term vision, especially usually private equity firms, I think, what have anywhere from 5 to 10 year kind of time horizon they typically look at these properties. So the ROI timeline is quite long. If you were to invest all this money up front, it takes a long time for you to quote unquote get back your money, correct?
If you're just looking at it in terms of energy, sure.
Correct.
But that's kind of been what's plagued the energy efficiency market for decades, is that when you just look at it in terms of energy saved, it's very difficult to get that payback. But like I said, when you look at it in terms of avoided maintenance costs, right? Because now instead of chasing down all of these failing systems, you can reallocate your maintenance staff to something more high value to keep your residents happier. Now you've got savings on the maintenance. You're no longer paying for emergency replacements. You have increased the value of your property because you have all brand new systems. You kind of reset that maintenance baseline. So now you don't have to have as much capital reserves for equipment failures. And it also makes it easier to raise money, right? Because now if you're going in with a plan to completely reset this building and raise it to modern standards, now it's more valuable in the market. And so you can underwrite that value, and it's more than just the energy savings.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
the ROI is not just a very simple return on investment from energy standpoint. It's really an underwriting exercise in the value of the property.
Interesting. Yeah, because if you take into account the increased value of the property, then the ROI is actually probably pretty quick, right? Interesting. So one thing I'm curious about, I've had someone on the show before, mostly focused on commercial real estate. I'm not sure how it applies here. But the conversation, if I remember correctly, was around how usually making a building green reduces, overall operating expenses pretty significantly. I don't remember the exact percentage he shared, but it also allowed them to charge higher rents, especially for commercial tenants. So it sounds like most of these are not commercial tenants, but I'm kind of curious to hear if there is a strong demand for green buildings from residential tenants that are looking for this ability, and does it actually widen the margins both ways?
So we actually operate in industrial buildings, office buildings, and multifamily buildings.
Okay.
So from the office side, yes, tenants want to know that their operating expenses are going to be lower. So in general, they will allow you to charge a higher rent for that, right? There's also green lease mechanisms where you can have specific written language in your lease that will allow you to recover your investment in energy efficiency as long as the tenant benefits from it. So if you can amortize your expenses over 30 years and that amortization expense is less than the savings to the tenant, then they benefit, right? And so you can automatically amortize that into their costs. On the industrial side, it's very similar. If you have a space that's going to have lower operating costs, then you can gain a higher rent in the market because it's all comparative, right? And when you can get a more sophisticated tenant to think about total cost of occupancy, which typically your industrial and your office tenants are going to think more sophisticated. They're going to be more on a business basis. On the residential side with multifamily, a lot of times you get people in the door with your first cost rent that's advertised in the market. So you then have to explain the benefit of the systems to the tenants. And when they understand that their utility costs are going to be cheaper than a place down the road, it definitely helps leasing, right? And you will get some premium for that because now there's more demand for your property. As long as you have good real estate, then that holds, right? And that's why we run our processes hand in hand with the real estate acquisition team, because as long as you have good fundamentals in your real estate, then you will have demand from tenants, and therefore you can gain a higher lease rate in the market because you have a premium product over the property down the road.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. One thing I hope you can speak to, because I've been, as somebody who's interested in architecture generally, kind of nerding out about this lately, trying to figure this out, is are there particular designs of buildings which make it more energy efficient? Like, for example, if you take a multifamily property, apartment building style versus side by side, like, are there any specific things that from doing this a while now, you see, hey, this kind of building tends to be more efficient because of the nature of the layout, or anything like that? I'm just really
Yeah.
curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it depends on your geography, right?
Okay.
And it's called form factor, right? What does the form factor of the building look like? Very long buildings versus very condensed tight buildings versus how tall they are. It depends on the type of building and where you are. So if we think about an office building in the South, if you have a ton of exterior surface area compared to your internal volume, then you're going to have a lot of heat gain, solar heat gain. So it's not going to be as efficient necessarily as a building with less surface area to volume ratio, right? And so if you are in the north, right, you might want that gain, or you've got to look at what the construction of your building is, because that extra surface area of the exterior can cause more heat loss because you've got a much greater temperature difference between the outdoor and indoor in heating in the north than you do in cooling in the summer. Right. So there are definitely trade-offs that architects and engineers go through when they're designing a building to determine what form factor makes the most sense for that geography. Now, when you're retrofitting a building, you can't do anything about it, right?
Yeah.
But there are things that are more attractive. So, for example, a townhouse style community, multifamily community, where every unit kind of has its own vertical floor plate, then you have a roof area that's kind of dedicated to that particular unit. Whereas if you are multi-story, that roof area has to be shared between all of those units down below. So if you're trying to do solar, you kind of want more surface area, more spread out, to be able to cover more of the load with solar. Whereas if you have a lot of very high-rise complex, then you have less surface area of the roof to cover less of the apartments. Then you get into things like the construction type. So frame construction is probably not going to be as airtight as concrete poured walls, right? Just thinking about it conceptually, but you can make framed walls very, very tight. So there are things that make a building just inherently more efficient, but it depends on the use type, it depends on the occupancy, it depends on the mechanical system type that you're going to use to serve that. So there's a lot that goes into that.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're along the right path in that the geometry of the building can definitely impact its energy consumption.
Yeah, I just think it's interesting because when I was young, I helped, basically, I was kind of helped my dad build the house that my parents live in now. And I remember him explaining a lot. He's not an engineer by any means, but we're in Wisconsin, so he faced it to the south most of the windows, so that during the winter when the leaves are off, there's more heat. And I just kind of got interested in the idea of efficiency from that perspective, because it's a convection heat type of building, so it's interesting. But um, cool. I appreciate that. It's really interesting to learn about. One thing I wanted to talk about as well is I guess, are there any ways that you try to engage the community? Because obviously it's in the name, renew community. Are there ways you try to engage your tenants to try to become more interested in this? Because I'm assuming oftentimes, you're inheriting tenants that may or may not have this interest, right? So how are you trying to engage them to get them to be more efficient, et cetera, once they're already in there?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And there's a couple of different ways we approach that. So we do tenant education sessions. where we describe to the tenants what just happened to their property. What are all these new systems going in? What were all the contractors that were around, and how are the tenants going to benefit from these improvements? Right. So again, every time we do a retrofit, we want to make sure investors, landlords, and tenants all benefit from the improvements. And from the tenant standpoint, that can mean fewer maintenance calls. It can mean better indoor air quality, better comfort, better energy bills. And so we want to explain to the tenants all the different benefits that they're getting. And some of that comes with educating the property managers so that they can talk to the tenants, potential tenants, about what they're getting versus the property down the road. Some of it is direct tenant engagement and having the Q&A session so that they can ask any questions they may have. And then the final step is really just around the marketing and the information that we give to the tenants about the systems. One of the pieces of information we give to the tenants is about their energy management system or their energy monitoring system that's in their units. We use a direct real-time energy monitoring system in every apartment unit, where the tenants can pull up on an app what their energy consumption is, and they get automated alerts on how they can improve their own energy efficiency, right? So it's about education, but also giving them the tools to understand what they can do and how they can improve their own situation.
Interesting. Yeah, that is pretty fascinating. I think the education of the general public on these things is a super difficult issue that somebody has to take on, right? And I think it can't be done en masse across everyone, right? So everybody has to do a little bit here and there. One thing you mentioned, which I am kind of keen, I've always been interested in this idea, is you talked about indoor air quality. Now, I'm curious if you know if there's been studies done or any kind of proof points yet on how having a sustainable building and the improved air quality actually affects health positively, whether that's any numbers around reduced chances of diseases or medical visits, things like that. Is there any information or insight that you know of from the industry that you could share with us?
Yeah, I have read studies. There's a lot of science and a lot of research out there on this, but I kind of haven't seen the definitive study on green buildings. But it comes down to good ventilation, good air circulation, good comfort, eliminating fossil fuels. It's kind of a lot of things that we already know about, right? But then
Mm-hmm.
a lot of indoor air quality is about the way people live, right? A lot of people's own indoor air quality is caused by themselves, right? So it's about education around using exhaust fans and using ventilation fans in bathrooms and in your kitchens, and kind of helping tenants understand what causes indoor air quality issues and how they have the tools to really help themselves already.
Yeah, that's interesting. This plays into the next question I have, which is on insurance of the buildings, right? Because if you have a green building, you talked about you're making all these improvements, etc. I'm curious if the tie here is that I have this theory at some point, individuals who live in green buildings, if they live in green buildings primarily throughout their life, their life insurance or health insurance costs will be reduced. I think that's something that should be coming down the road. But on the building side, are there insurance benefits from your perspective when you're, insuring the buildings? Are there benefits, in the premiums that you're paying there as well once this building is retrofitted?
I think we will get there. I don't think the industry is quite there yet. In the matter of the last 4 years or so, the lending industry has come around to recognizing green buildings have a premium and green buildings have less risk, and green buildings should have a lower interest rate associated with loans because they are a better investment.
Hmm.
And that took a long time, right? I mean, we've been talking about sustainability really since the 70s, and just now lenders are coming around to that in a meaningful way to offer incentives for green building programs. I don't think the insurance companies have gotten there yet. I don't think they've realized that a building that you've invested a wholesale retrofit in, where you've brought it up to modern standards, you've got all brand new mechanical equipment, you've got better comfort, you've got tenants that are happier, you're going to be leased longer, et cetera. I don't think they've come around to the fact that it's also a lower risk to insure, because your building is maintained better. People are investing in the building and they're caring about it more. You know, you also have to think about the climate change component of insuring a building, right? And just doing your part to improve the energy efficiency doesn't change the fact that you have climate risk for certain buildings, from extreme weather, from droughts, fires, floods, hurricanes, all of that. And I think that will trump any potential savings in the insurance industry from a green building perspective, when you think about the overall average cost to insure a building. And so that's part of the real estate assessment that you have to go through when you're evaluating a building is, okay, now what is the climate risk of my building 10 years from now, 20 years from now, if I'm going to make this investment? So I think that the insurance industry is probably going to take on that portion of the concept versus the value.
Because that would increase rates. Interesting. I think it's an interesting problem, but I also wonder if there's a potential for, not that they have the interest in doing it, but there's a potential for insurance companies to help incentivize building owners. Because like, if you think about it, one building in the grand scheme isn't making a massive impact, right? It's not making a huge dent. But if you can do that across a plethora of buildings, that can make a pretty strong impact globally, right? So it's tough, right? It's a very tough situation. I understand people, there's operating margins that have to be met. But no, this is interesting. I'm trying to think of any other specific questions I have there. Sorry, go ahead.
Unfortunately, that's what we need, right? We need different industries to think on a macro level. We need the lending community, we need the real estate community, we need the insurance community to think about, okay, what if we made these incremental changes in every single building, right? What if we require it as part of a loan? What if we require it as part of insuring a building, where you have to make certain energy improvements in order to address climate change, right? In industries like that can make a real difference in the built environment, but I haven't seen the proactive collaboration of the industry in order to make that happen. But if you think about the real drivers of getting a real estate deal done, it's investors, it's a loan, right? And then it's the insurance and being able to close out all the paperwork for a property, right? So if each one of those entities, really embrace the opportunity for energy improvements and carbon footprint reduction of a building, then you could make some very large impacts to the industry. And we've only got 30 years, right? We've got less than 30 years to reach a fully carbon neutral energy sector. And we're not even close to being on the right track.
Yeah, there's so much work to be done. It is difficult to get everybody mobilized. But this is one thing, maybe one last kind of more technical question I want to ask is, are there, you mentioned looking into the utilities incentives, and I think obviously we had potentially wanted to talk about the IRA incentives. I know we're going to skip over that, but I might want to bring it in here. Are there specific incentives, anything new, or people maybe they're old and people aren't aware of them, that can actually relatively substantially add to the bottom line of a real estate owner's income from the building, aside just from tenant payments?
Yeah, so let me kind of step back and talk about my perspective on the IRA in general. I think that was one of the most impactful energy bills that could have ever been passed, right? I mean, now there are things that I would change about it. There are things that I would make more clear, more transparent, but in general, the IRA touched on every single aspect of energy, right? Energy production, utilities, buildings, homes. It really touched a lot of different areas, and it worked to make energy efficiency and carbon reduction the default choice. right? So it promoted the production of um, renewable energy here in the US, which makes supply chains easier, which makes acquisition of materials and supplies easier. It promoted electric vehicles, which makes it easier to afford electric vehicles and made them more prominent. So it becomes that default choice when you go to the dealership. It promoted utility investment in the transmission infrastructure to make sure that we can get the renewable energy spread across the US, right? But then from the building side, it provided direct rebates to consumers to, if at the very least, create awareness around technologies that contractors can promote, like heat pumps, like electrification of your building. And it creates that conversation. But when you provide the direct incentives to upgrading your electrical panel, to buy down the cost of a high efficiency heat pump directly at the homeowner level, it makes those the default choice, and it helps push the industry along to where we need. So part of the high efficiency electric home rebate act, right, HERA, is really looking at the states deploying that money to the homeowner level, and from my perspective, to the multifamily owner level, to areas with low and moderate income residents, right? So it's really trying to push those benefits to the area of the people that need it most, right? And the people that can really benefit from it most, because they don't have the free cash flow to invest in energy efficiency. So I think it was really a monumental piece of legislation that pushes our country in the right direction. Now, I step back from that, and kind of my complaints with it is there's so much to it that we still don't have clarity on how a lot of it's going to be implemented, on how the money is going to be released. And it's so complicated that there's a lot of that money eaten up in the bureaucracy, right? Eaten up in the distribution of the funds. And that I kind of have a problem with. But in general, it was very impactful and touched a lot of different meaningful areas.
Mm-hmm. But can we go back to, I want to understand if you would comment again on the actual bottom line contribution to owning an asset. I think it's more important from a multifamily perspective, because a lot of homeowners directly will benefit, of course, right? But from a multifamily perspective, it's usually more difficult. Could you talk about some of those contributions to their annual bottom line?
Yeah. So I mentioned the HERA program, right? For the buildings that are eligible for that, I mean, that will be thousands of dollars worth of direct rebates that can go into the pocket of the real estate owners, right? They'll get their share of it back to the investors, but those real estate owners will really benefit from that, and it will buy down the cost of investing in energy efficiency. And that directly improves the bottom line. Then you have things like the investment tax credit into renewable energies. So part of the IRA was making that investment tax credit transferable to other entities in a much easier manner than historically. You had to set up this special purpose entity where you had to hold it for 5 years, and then you could buy out one partner and keep another partner in, right? And it's this whole partnership flip strategy where you have a lot of time, a lot of lawyers, brain power in it, and really it devalues or deflates the value of that investment tax credit to the person buying it. And it's a very cumbersome system. Well, under the IRA, you can transfer that credit much easier without all of the red tape and without all the hassles, which means that you can knock 30% off the cost of buying and installing a renewable energy system, right? That's a very meaningful number. When you can take 30% right off the bottom because you can now transfer that tax credit very efficiently, that is a direct benefit to everyone involved.
Yeah, that's interesting. That is interesting. Very good. Well, I think we're just about out of time here. I want to just ask the last thing to wrap things up is, what is your general outlook on, let's just call it the green building space? There's many names for it. Let's call it green buildings and green real estate in general in the next 3 to 5 years. What are some things that to you are very obvious now, but maybe are not to the general public, that you think in a year or two or whatever, that will become kind of like commonplace for us?
I think we're going to see so many different drivers from so many different directions that it becomes an obvious choice, right? I think your investors are going to demand uh, carbon footprint reduction. Your governments, your states, your utilities are going to incentivize that carbon reduction very aggressively and very efficiently. And then you're going to see demand from residents grow dramatically, or residents or tenants, really building occupants are going to begin to demand it, right? Electric vehicles are one of those enabling technologies where people start to think greener. They start to think differently about energy efficiency once they drive an electric vehicle, and it changes their life. And I think that same sort of things will happen around heat pumps and the concept of a heat pump and the concept of a solar panel. It just becomes obvious, right? You see it and you don't think twice about it, and you think differently about when you see a building without it. So I think that's more on that 5-year, maybe 10-year time frame, but that's the point we have to get to. And so I think the pace of adoption of these technologies are going to accelerate. But I think the thing that we're going to see in the next 5 years that will be revolutionary in the building space are heat pumps that can replace natural gas boilers, right? Natural gas and heating oil is very predominant in colder climates, right? And even in the South, you have a lot of water heating that's done with natural gas. And I think we're going to see heat pumps that can effectively replace those technologies and provide that same level of heat output, so that you can then take natural gas and keep it at a centralized level and do things like decarbonize that natural gas at the source versus distributing it. So those are kind of my predictions over the next 5 years.
Yeah, interesting. Very good. Well, this has been pretty great. I really enjoy you coming on here and talking to us about this stuff. And any final plugs, or where people can reach you, or where they should reach out and get in contact?
Yeah, we can be reached through renew-communities.com.
Awesome. Very good. Thanks so much, Chris. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, Silas. Appreciate your time.
All right. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed, please do share this with somebody who might find it interesting. Give us a review, and it really does help us grow the show. So really appreciate your help as a listener to do your part to help the show get grown. We put a lot of effort into the back end, but it's only going to work if people are interested in it and want to share it with people out there. So, and then I do encourage you, if you're interested, reach out to Chris directly and connect with him, learn more about RENU Communities, go through their website. And if this is your first time, please do subscribe and tap the bell for notifications. So quick note on our next episode, really excited to bring this one to you. So next episode, we will be speaking with Ethan Goldsmith of Keyframe Capital. And this is really interesting to me because Keyframe is not exactly a traditional VC, really because they have a flexible remit model, which allows them to provide various types of capital to their portfolio companies rather than just pure, VC equity play. And there's a lot of genuinely very interesting things in this conversation, but the biggest thing I will note is I think this model is something we need to see a lot more of, because I believe it is the clearest solution that I've seen so far to the funding valley of death that hardware climate tech companies go through. I think any hardware tech entrepreneur and founder out there understands the difficulties of this, and I really genuinely believe that this can be a pretty solid solution to that while the technology is being proven and while low cost of capital is not available yet, kind of bridging that gap until the technology becomes, what solar is today, where private equity is willing to take on the risk, because there's essentially no risk at that point, right? So very interesting conversation with Ethan. A lot of very powerful and interesting things here. I would say please stay tuned for that one, especially if you're a founder in the hardware tech space looking at going into a funding round or in the middle of a funding round. Very helpful things there. And as always, thank you so much for joining us on the Clean Techies podcast, and we will see you next time.